I'm Janice Kaminer-Resnick, and on behalf of Jews United for Democracy and Justice and Community Advocates, Inc., I warmly welcome you to our 63rd consecutive week of America at a Crossroads virtual town hall series. Our program tonight features the exceptional former chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Mullen, who is just such a wonderful person. Thank you to my dear friend and the amazing Susie Jones, bookbinder, for sharing her friendship with the Admiral with us so that we could have the honor of hosting him tonight and learning from him. Our leadership team includes Mel Levine, David Lehrer, Zev Yaroslavsky, Caroline Kelly, and Rabbi Ken Chazen. And you saw the list of all of our co-sponsors on the screen a moment ago, and we're grateful to all of them. We have some great programs coming up. In fact, in the next 4 weeks, we have just 4 excellent programs. David will share the next 2 weeks programs with you in a minute. I just want to remind you that on August 4th, the dynamic duo of Steve Levitsky and Daniel Zyblatt, who wrote the critically acclaimed book entitled How Democracies Die, will be with us. And we're very thrilled to announce that on August 11th, Lieutenant Colonel Alex Vindman will be with us again, who he was bullied into retirement, as you all probably remember, after truthfully testifying pursuant to a subpoena in the first Trump impeachment trial. And we're very excited to be hearing his personal story. The program is called Hear What's Right Matters, My American Story. We hope you will join us not only to hear his story, but to honor him as a true patriot. You can use the link in the email, which I promise you will be correct. It'll be sent to you right after the program. Just remember to register as early as possible for all of our programs. In the final hours, if you register, it's really hard to get you the Zoom link in time. And of course, we appreciate your donations. Now, by the way, there's a link for that as well. Now, my colleague and friend, David Lehrer, will give you some very brief highlights of upcoming additional programs.
Thank you, the indefatigable Janice Kaminer-Resnick. It's great to be here once again for America at a Crossroads virtual town hall. Tonight is a very special program with a familiar name and a familiar face, someone who was omnipresent on our TV screens and newspapers for 4 years. We host the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He was our country's top military man across 2 administrations. He'll be introduced in a minute. I want to let you know, as mentioned, about our 2 upcoming programs, which are particularly timely. Next week, we will have with us 2 Pulitzer Prize winners who are on the staff of the New York Times. The op-ed page's celebrated columnist Bret Stephens, who'll join us again, along with his colleague David Leonhardt. David is the founder of the Upshot column and a longtime business and economics writer and editor for the paper. They will explore the long-term implications of the COVID year on our economy, on our politics, and on our lives. It should be fascinating. The following week, we will have returning to our program 2 very smart veteran political practitioners and pundits who are at the University of Southern California Center for the Political Future, Bob Shrum and Mike Murphy. They will assess the political landscape 6 months into the Biden administration. Who's winning, who's losing, and what does it really all mean? It's now my pleasure to introduce a friend, our most frequent moderator, and a much honored journalist for his decades of work on television and radio, KCRW's terrific Warren Olney. Warren?
Hi, David. Thank you so much for that kind introduction. I'm so glad to be back with America at the Crossroads. And thank you so much for the opportunity to interview Admiral Mike Mullen, 17th chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He served during both the Obama and Bush administrations. He was involved in ending the war in Iraq and ending the life of Osama bin Laden. He retired in 2011. He is now on the boards of General Motors, Sprint, the Bloomberg Family Foundation. He's also on the faculty of the Woodrow Wilson School of International and Public Affairs at Princeton University. He's the founder of the MGM consulting firm, which has many global clients. And Admiral, I won't ask you what you do in your spare time, but it's a real treat to have you here. And thank you so much for being on this program.
Thank you, Warren. It's great to be with you. I appreciate it.
I just want to say also for the audience that we're glad that you are here, and you will be able to ask questions a bit later on. I'll be getting them texted to me by David Lehrer. I think you know the mechanism whereby you can get your questions introduced, and we'll be happy to hear them. So, Admiral, given that you are a very well-known former chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, I would be remiss if I did not ask you as the very first question, what is the state of national security in the United States?
Well, we're in a real pivotal moment, I think, Warren, shifting away from these wars, excuse me, over the last 20 plus years. Certainly what's going on right now in Afghanistan is an example of that, where we move away from the Middle East and the focus on the terrorists that brought us 9/11 in such a devastating way and really changed the world to some version of a great power competition again. I'm increasingly concerned with the rise of China. And when I say pivotal, I think we need to be moving to the West, if you will, focusing in that regard. Certainly, we have to pay attention as well, I think, to Russia. But I think the existential threat, the long-term existential threat to the United States is coming from China. And so the national security world is moving in that direction. Some would argue not as quickly as we should or as we could, but to me, that's the main focus.
President Obama wanted to pivot away from the Middle East too. He was unable to do it. People are saying that with regard to Afghanistan, that it is potentially a source of terrorism, given this relationship between the Taliban and Al Qaeda. Is that something we're just going to be dragged back into, or will the Israeli-Palestinian situation drag us back into the Middle East?
Well, I suppose that's always a possibility, Warren. But there are a number of terrorist groups who reside heavily in that border between Afghanistan and Pakistan, and we can't ignore that. I will say there's a tremendous amount of effort which has accrued over the last 20 years. I mean, since 9/11 for sure, to keep us from sustaining another terrorist attack. And that effort, to the great credit of many Americans nobody has ever heard of, I think that focus will continue. It'll be more difficult because we won't be on the ground there near that border, but it is something we have to continue to pay a lot of attention to. And I think it sort of depends. Drag back in is, I think, particularly when you listen to President Biden, we're coming out of there. I'm supportive of coming out now. And I think it would be very difficult to see the United States going back in. And with respect to the Middle East writ large, I mean, one of the things I've learned is we're not going to solve their problems for them. They're going to, and I sort of liken it as somebody that's been around a while, it's going to take decades to have them sort out their future. They're not the existential threat right now. I mentioned that. Even Iran, which is certainly of great concern, isn't existential to us. There are those who would argue, and I'd probably agree with them, it's existential to Israel. And I think we have to sustain our incredibly strong support for our ally in Israel and pay attention to that. But I think the real future with respect to the global instability, global chaos, if you will, resides in the Western Pacific, in the vicinity of China. 4 of the 5 top economies in the world are centered there. And I think that's one that we have to make sure stays stable, and that means no conflict. But that's also leverage, I think, with China that we can use to ensure that we don't get any kind of global conflict with them.
What about the condition of the Navy itself? You pointed out when we spoke yesterday that there was an editorial in the Wall Street Journal this week about a report by 2 retired senior officers indicating that in some ways it appears, and I think there are senators who have called it this way, that we're not really prepared for war as far as the Navy is concerned. Sailors say that the leadership is distracted. There is a deep culture of risk aversion, according to that op-ed or editorial, I guess it was.
Yeah.
What can you tell us about the Navy itself?
Well, it actually was an op-ed, and it focused on a particular part of the Navy, which was my community, the surface Navy, the ship community, the cruisers and destroyers, amphibious ships. And it really centered, or the review itself was caused by these collisions in 2017, in which we tragically lost 17 sailors. And there were lots of circumstances and lots of investigations associated with that. But we were running the ships very hard. We weren't taken care of what I would call the blocking and tackling. And this was obviously out in the Western Pacific. One of the things that's happened in the last 20 years, because we've been in these ground wars, we've had focus on the Army and the Marine Corps in terms of understanding the stories that come out to America. A little known story is how hard both the Air Force and the Navy have also been working. Their operational tempo has been way up. And one of the things that was pointed out in this particular article was the extensive deployments and extended deployments and repeated deployments. And you just can't keep doing that. So that has to be addressed. There's a lot of truth in what that particular op-ed said. I know the leadership is focused on that and has been certainly since these tragic collisions in 2017, but it's going to take a while to get back. And the whole issue, and we go through cycles, the whole issue of risk aversion. We pay our commanding officers, our O5 commanders of ships and submarines and squadrons, and actually battalions as well, to figure out how to take risk. I think one of the messages that comes from that is that the flag leadership is on them too much. This zero risk mentality, zero mistake mentality. You're not going to get ready for war, nor are you going to win a war with that mentality.
How did that come about?
I think over a long period of time, it's difficult to pin down. I mean, in the surface community world, it goes back literally from my perspective into the 90s. We went through a cycle at that time, and we have individuals, I think, striving too hard for promotion, not allowing younger officers to take risk and make mistakes. And then the younger officers see that and they say, well, that's not what we want to do. That's not an outfit we want to stay in. And so the ones that stay absorb that zero risk mentality. They then are promoted and pushed up the chain, if you will, to the same command positions. And it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, if you will. And that has to break, particularly now, given the threat that we've got from China in particular, because this theater is really going to be an Air Force and a Navy theater. It's not going to be a ground war if we go to war, and I hope we never do. But it's going to be a war fought at sea, in the air, under the water, by both the Air Force and the Navy and the Marine Corps to some extent. So we really do need to try to get this right.
I want to ask you more about what you said at the outset, that this is a pivotal moment. But before we do, a question that goes directly to being the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. There's been a rash of books, some of them by very well respected reporters of late, about the last weeks and months of the Trump administration. They have suggested, one or two of the reporters themselves have referred to the president as deranged or crazy, without necessarily agreeing with that. They do report that the president at one time suggested shooting protesters in the legs. He has the power to invoke the Insurrection Act. The Secretary of State was worried that he might start an international conflict. He was talked out of all of those things. But what if he hadn't been? What if he had issued orders as the commander-in-chief? What about the chain of command, and what options would there be for a chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff if we had a truly deranged leader?
Well, the chairman, I mean, in my view, would be in a position, if he received orders like that he fundamentally disagreed with, would be to put his resignation letter in. And then all of the Joint Chiefs, same thing, I think would have to follow, so that the president couldn't get to a military leader that was going to execute those orders. Now, that would create a huge crisis in the government, huge crisis in the administration, huge political crisis for the president, as well as the country. And you hope you never get to that. I mean, one of the things, and I think there will probably be more and more of these books over time, as there tends to be after, a president leaves. But even as as crazy as some of these things may sound, or as chaotic, and it was very chaotic in many ways, not just at the end, but it was chaotic. But Warren, in the end, the system held. The totality of the system held, and we didn't execute any of those options through the combined efforts of an awful lot of people, including, General Milley, who was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs and was heavily involved with the president and the White House constantly on so many of these issues, as was his predecessor, General Dunford, who was also there with President Trump. So I'm actually buoyed up, if you will, because the system did hold. I certainly wouldn't recommend trying to test it that way many times.
One more what if question, and it's sort of unfair to ask these, it seems to me. On the other hand, they're important. The president has the sole power to use nuclear weapons. William Perry, who was Secretary of Defense at one point, has said, and has others as well who are knowledgeable about nuclear weapons, that if in fact they are used, it will be the end of the planet as we know it, or civilization as we know it. Does that need to be changed? And is there a better way of organizing the authority over nuclear weapons?
I think with the systems that we have, which again, held even through a chaotic 4 years with the Trump administration, have over time served us well. I agree with what Secretary Perry said, that should these weapons be unleashed, it really would be the end of mankind. And that is the concern in particular with Russia, but also now, I ended up negotiating the last treaty myself with my Russian counterpart in 2010. But one of the thoughts I had at the time was, as we reduced the number, and China had a relatively small number, certainly compared to us, when would China get interested in getting in this game? And quite frankly, I've seen information very recently where China has made that decision to get in. There was a front page story, I think, of the Washington Post a week or two ago that talked about them essentially creating missile silos throughout the country, if you will. So they've decided to get in, and these truly are weapons that would destroy the world. Your question, literally within 2 or 3 weeks, within actually a week of President Trump coming in, I was asked this, by an individual. It's the system that we have. Is there a way to stop him? Probably. Along the same lines of what I talked about, it would have to be intercepted. But the fact of the matter is, being able to respond literally within seconds and minutes is a requirement that deters the Russians from ever using it. And messing around with that, changing that, would be a very, very delicate and risky task. So, I'm supportive of getting rid of all of them, but we don't get to vote on what China does or what Russia does. So where Bill Perry and Henry Kissinger and George Shultz, Sam Nunn, and others have been in this global zero world, that's where I am. But you have to get there. You can't just get there by, sort of cartoonish, nor can you, I don't think, can you unilaterally come down, because I think the risk associated with that, with Putin and with Xi Jinping, is very, very high.
Once again, you said at the outset that we're at a pivotal moment. And referring back again to our conversation of yesterday, you said that what you really want to talk about is the decline of the country. Yeah. What do you mean by the decline of the country?
Maybe I can use a recent example. The tragedy of COVID over the last 15, 16, 17 months. The way I describe that is that was almost like an X-ray of us. And the X-ray found cancer everywhere. It found cancer in our healthcare system. It found cancer in our education system. It found cancer in our political system, in our medical system. It found cancer in the inequality. It found cancer in the racial aspect of who we are. So sort of across the board. And then tied to that are these institutions on which we've relied for, forever, that seem to be unable to deliver for the American people. I mean, I've personally, and I've been in Washington a lot since 2001, and I've watched this political dissension, if you will, and the political divide and intensity just grow and grow and grow. And these are people that are sent to Washington to do things for the American people. And I've just come to believe that that body is out of touch with the American people. The number of times I've talked across the country in the last decade, and the Americans say, just tell them to stop the squabbling, tell them to solve the problems. It's just extraordinary. And it seems as though the extremes of both parties are sort of running the trains, which don't get to solutions in the middle, which is where most Americans are. And the ability to create those solutions along the lines of the kinds of things I was talking about, whether it's healthcare, education, the issues of racism, which were certainly and sadly and tragically highlighted with George Floyd and the aftermath of that. We've got work to do, and it's hard for me to understand how that work is going to get done. We need leadership. We need courageous leadership, and it needs to be, quite frankly, courageous political leadership, because like it or not, politicians, that's what they do. They're supposed to solve problems. They just haven't solved many of them lately.
You said earlier that the system held with regard to President Trump and the concerns that there were about what he might do. And now you're saying, though, that the institutions that we have are unable to deliver. Is there a contradiction there, or a distinction that needs to be made?
Well, maybe I'd make the distinction that in those specific cases that you raised, national security, the system did hold. I can't say the system's holding in other areas, certainly like healthcare or the social issues that we face, or the income inequality. I mean, you mentioned I'm on the board of General Motors. Actually, I left there a couple of years ago, but I can remember sitting down with a political pundit at a board meeting in 2015, I think, looking at the landscape of what was coming. And this was before Trump, quite frankly. And the pundit reminded us as a board that real wages hadn't gone up in this country since 1970. That was a stunner for me. I mean, I like to think, I have my antenna up and I read a little bit to try and stay in touch. But that issue itself, which just drives so much of our lives, and that to me, I tied directly to the disappearance of the American dream, the opportunity that's there, because there's no hope. One of the things you'll learn pretty quickly, sadly, in these countries I've been in where we've been fighting terrorists, whether it's Iraq or Afghanistan or Somalia, other places in Northern Africa, is for young kids who are 15, 16 years old, they sort of come to a crossroads. And I describe that as a crossroads. A 15-year-old young boy will make a decision. Am I going to go get educated and try to contribute, which means I have some hope at this point? Or am I going to put on an IED and blow myself to kingdom come because I have no hope? And I find more and more, there are more and more Americans without hope. And without that, there isn't much of a future. So that's as huge a concern as I have. We talked briefly before about, what's the number one threat to the country? I think we're the number one threat to our country and to our future. And that all of us, young and old, and I fear greatly for my kids and my grandkids, but all of us need to be engaged. All of us we can't be sitting back just watching it in our couches. We have to get up and we have to engage if we're going to change this trend, which is not going in the right direction.
I can't help but mention climate change and the inevitable problems that that's going to cause, it's pretty clear from a scientific point of view that we can't stop it. All we can do is try to mitigate what will happen as a result of it. Is that something you're concerned about too?
I
And is
am,
that an
yeah.
opportunity for some of these institutions to get off it and perform the functions they're supposed to?
It is. I am increasingly concerned about that, and there are those that believe it clearly is existential to the country. My challenge is it still gets lost in this political debate, and it gets politicized, and you really have to go to work to figure out what the science is and what the right answer is. I mean, just literally this week, we are on the East Coast. We're greener than we've been in a long time. We've received, more rainfall, and then you just take a picture of the map and look at what's going on out west where you are, and so many of you are. And I've seen evidence of this. It goes back to Banda Aceh or Katrina, and in my own experience in the military, and I wasn't out there, advocating for climate change back then. But there's something going on here because the events are more serious, they're more frequent, and they are affecting more people. So, under that umbrella of climate change, there's not going to be a natural solution here. We have polluted and contaminated this planet, and we are, the carbon emissions thing, is very real science. It is getting warmer. We understand the effects of that. We have to work to mitigate it.
One of the things I understand you're concerned about is the national debt. Tell us why.
I think 2010, I was walking down the hall in the Pentagon and a reporter asked me what the number one threat was to the country. And I said, because I'd thought about it, I said our national debt. And just to remind everybody, in 2010, our national debt then was about $10 trillion. Depending on who you talk to right now, that number is now up around 30 trillion. And in fact, many people who were previously concerned about our national debt seem less concerned, almost conditioned by the argument is we're not paying a whole lot more interest on that debt in terms of the percent of our GDP now than we were way back when. So it's okay, we can keep borrowing. I worry about that just falling out from under us, where we the percent of our taxes, if you will, continues to go for a larger and larger percentage of our borrowing, and I don't see any end in sight. I haven't seen it slow down. I mean, there are spenders on both sides of the aisle, certainly for the last 20 plus years, in a surprising way. We have to spend this money now after the pandemic to get the economy going. I'm not sure we need to spend as much as we're talking about because the economy all of a sudden seems to be picking up pretty well. We need to have people employed. But I'm hugely concerned about that in the long run. I'm someone that actually believes, the answer to the future lies in economies, in the financial system, the economies, the income aspect of it, the American dream. How do we create the package, if you will, where that's still possible and things are moving in the right direction? And the more we spend, the more pessimistic I am about the opportunity to actually turn that around.
It's often said that the United States spends more, and demonstrated this, the United States spends more on defense than the next 5 or 6 countries combined, including Russia and China. Is there a way to cut defense spending in such a way that it might be helpful to the problem with the national debt?
I think actually no. I mean, when you look at I'll answer that. I'll try to answer that a couple ways. I mean, there is an opportunity to spend less, if you will. The Pentagon has enough money. It's less about the amount of money right now as to where you spend it. But like the private sector, the Pentagon spends 65, 70, 75% of its money on the people and the benefits. And we have, over the last 20 or 30 years, we've increased the compensation package for our military, active duty military men and women considerably. And it's a pretty good package these days. The health benefits, the retirement benefits. So it's not I mean, a lot of the focus and discussion debate centers on these weapons, but 70% of our Pentagon budget is tied up in people, but that's military and civilians. And I think we can make some adjustments there. If you zeroed, I mean, given 30 trillion, if you took out, 700 billion, you're not going to do much with that debt. I mean, it is, and it has been for some time. It's the healthcare costs, the Medicare costs, Medicaid costs, and Social Security. We still have time to do something about Social Security to make adjustments so that it doesn't become completely intractable in terms of paying for it. I think we're almost out of Schlitz with respect to the Medicare and the Medicare's costs, and I think most of us know that we pay more than just about anybody in the world for what are middling results. When you look at what's capable around the world, that's what's got to be. That is the avenue. That's the path. That doesn't mean we can't reduce spending in the Pentagon, but that's not going to solve it.
You're not on the board of General Motors anymore, and I apologize for seeing what apparently was an old biography. But what about taxes, particularly corporate taxes? And do they need to be increased? Does the IRS need to go after those companies that allegedly, reportedly, simply aren't paying their fair share?
Yeah, I mean, my take on that is, we've had systems in place forever which incentivize paying as little as possible, and whether it's individual or institutional, including corporate. My sense of that is that at whatever they were before, which was 35%, I think, or something like that, and bringing it down to 21 was too much, and that where we are, at least the number that I hear kicked around right now is upwards of 28%, and I'm fine with that. I quite frankly, if you're getting at this sort of global tax, global minimum, I think is something else that's out there. And I think we all have to pay our fair share, but we need to take the incentives away across the board that in terms of corporations, which they take advantage of legally, they take advantage of, and in the long run, I think they'll pay their fair share. And there are a lot of smart people running those things, running those outfits, and they'll figure out how to make those outfits work, even with a higher tax burden. They're under, I didn't appreciate this, but I mean, they are under enormous pressure from their investors, shareholders, clearly. From my perspective, there's too much short-term gain. That's short-term focus. That's also true in the country about a lot of other things, but there's too much short-term focus, not long-term. And I think if we could move the lens out a little bit to longer term, the companies could adjust in a way that they could still be very profitable, but also pay their fair share.
You have a consulting firm that deals with global matters and global entities. To what extent is the private sector, do you think, concerned about the same kinds of things that you are? And will there be leadership from there, even if we don't see it immediately, at least, from the political world?
Yeah, I actually, my take on that is that the private companies are very concerned about that. The ones who are the biggest and maybe even the most influential, they are big outfits. I've worked in big outfits. Big outfits don't change quickly. And they, I mean, I can use General Motors as an example, just the whole, and I've got a lot of time for Mary Barra, who's a great CEO, and you can see General Motors is all in on electric. And a lot of that has to do with ESG and the environment, clearly, and the view that is the future. The challenge is timing on this. And obviously you don't want to put yourself out of business missing that timing. So there's a conservative aspect. How fast can you do this? The same is true. I mean, obviously the same is true in energy. How fast can we get to non-contaminating energy sources, if you will? I did a study 5 or 6 years ago that, I mean, for the foreseeable future, that was then and really well into the next 15 or 20 years, our transportation system is 90% dependent on oil, and that's just not going to change. And so how do you break these habits becomes the real question, because we like it is, even though we know it's going to change in the future. That becomes very difficult to get to sometimes. But I see many private leaders who actually are very concerned about this. And there's also lots of companies that are under pressure now for the environment and sustainability aspects of their life that the shareholders are bringing. I think that needs to play a significant part as well, because they actually do pay attention to what their shareholders are saying.
What about the Green New Deal and the idea that all of these things go together and need to be dealt with in a radical way as soon as possible, particularly to hold off global warming?
I just think, Warren, I don't know. To me, this is Mike Mullen talking. The Green New Deal is way too much magic at this point. It needs to be real, and I'm a pragmatist. You just can't get there by writing out a cartoon. They're really, and I'll just use the electric vehicle example. I know what it's taking for GM to get to that future in terms of investment and time and technology and engineers and relationships, all those kinds of things. You just, another example is sort of the wind farms. Yes, will they provide energy? They certainly will, but you can't just write them in and shut down everything else that you're doing. So I think maybe the vision or the aspiration long term is something that's worthwhile, but I think the idea that you just throw it all in and shut everything else down now to get there is it's not realistic. It's not practical.
You mentioned that real wages haven't been increased for decades.
Yeah.
What do we do about that? Is it time for an increase in taxes? Would that be a way to go?
Well, I'm not smart enough on the tax side. I think, I mean, this becomes that argument, the eternal argument about, lower taxes generates, higher growth. To me, the measure is how fast is the economy growing? We talked about the debt. If interest rates go up, and another thing about the debt, if interest rates go up, the debt, the level of debt goes up exponentially as well. There's been analysis over the course of the last decade that shows that there, in times where there are Democrats running the country, the economy seems to thrive, and less so for Republicans. Although, quite frankly, under the Trump administration, it was stunning what happened to the economy. But you've got to, the idea, what Trump showed was you can actually grow the economy more than 1 or 2 or 3%. And I think that growth has to be what fuels a future, if you will, if we're going to pay down the debt, create the jobs, create the American dream. We're not going to be able to do it at 1 or 2%. And I've seen, I read within the last couple of days that there will be big growth this year, big growth in 22, and then in 23 or 24, 25, it's going to get back down to 1s and 2s. And that's just, to me, that's just not going to hack it. The question is, how do you make the economy grow? And obviously there are two different views on how to do that. You've
been pretty specific and very candid about a lot of things. I take it you don't plan to run for office?
No. I've been asked that. And the people know, it's no secret that I'm on the Bloomberg board. When Mike was considering running in 2016, that he was considering me as his vice presidential candidate. But and I obviously very difficult conversation even in my own house. But part of it is, for me, it's not how I've been brought up. I mean, the values I have, the principles I have, having, spent 43 years in uniform, they're different from a lot of politicians. And bringing that into the political world it's not me. I know it's been done before. People say, well, what about Eisenhower? I get that, but Eisenhower was 1952. I've been around long enough. That was a long time ago. And it is less to me, Warren, about being able to do the job than the gauntlet that you have to go through to get to the point where you actually get elected. It is brutal, as you've seen. The world of opposition research, which is a very fluid and beneficial world to people that do that. We just look to destroy each other. And that's something I just, I wouldn't stand up to very well.
I could do this for all night, but it is time to give our listeners an opportunity to ask some questions. And we've got a lot of good ones. There are quite a few people who want to know how serious you think is the risk of cyber war.
Very serious. I think there are, I talked about existential threats. One, I think we are our own existential threat right now. And what you're doing here and what Janice started and the whole idea of, focusing on justice and democracy and the country is absolutely critical. So that's one. The other, another existential threat are the nuclear weapons. And I actually thought, naively so, but I thought when I finished the negotiations and President Obama and Medvedev in Russia signed that treaty in 2010, that we're sort of on the brink of putting those weapons away. And that has not happened. You hear Putin talk more and more about those in recent times, which scares me. So those weapons are still existential. And by existential, I mean, wipe each other off the face of the earth. Fundamentally, our life as we know it changes forever. And then the third one really is cyber warfare, because cyber warfare can effectively change our life for the future for a long time. If you could imagine, essentially melting down our financial system, if you could imagine melting down our grid. I was the head of the Navy in 2005 when we had Katrina, and I had 90,000 sailors and family members in the South who were affected by that. We had Navy divers in the Mississippi River, and I had no clue the commerce that came down the Mississippi, that if we hadn't been able to clear it out of the mouth, would have backed this country up in ways that, none of us really understand. Recently, the example of a single ship, albeit a big one, jamming up the Suez Canal, and look what happened to that. What happened with the Colonial Pipeline, just with the ransomware. One of the numbers I read was 17,000 gas stations, either in North Carolina or the Southeast, with no gas within a couple days. So cyber has great potential for good, but used against us, it could really do a lot of damage.
Are you able to say at this point whether we are, doing a sufficient amount to prevent that from happening, given the enormous issues or problems that we've seen just in the past few days?
The question almost answers itself, that we're not able to do what we can. Part of the problem is, and this is our system, but part of the challenge is the National Security Agency, General Nakasone, who's in charge of that. And basically that's an agency that does things globally. He also has his other hat is the commander of Cyber Command. The challenge that and the Pentagon has notionally, protect the country. The challenge that Nakasone has is he can't see what's going on inside the country. And that's where you can't see what happens or the threat that's coming to Colonial. And there are tremendous issues associated with how much of the government do you want to let loose to understand what's going on in company A, B, or C. That said, we are not going to solve this problem until there's an agreement between the private sector and the government. That's just not going to happen. And we're in trouble as a result of the, what's his name? The guy in Russia that stole all that stuff, that compromised our tools, but also compromised what was going on in the private sector to some degree. And we've got to get back from that. But the answer is we're going to have to figure out how to work together, the government and the private sector. Otherwise, we're going to continue to get beat up.
The current chair of Joint Chiefs of Staff has the Space Force under his jurisdiction. David wants to know, do you think the Space Force is a good idea?
Yeah, I actually do. I wasn't overly favorable initially, but as I learned more about it, I think that's absolutely that it was a good idea, or it is a good idea. It's an area that, just like cyber, I mean, cyber is a new domain, so is space. And where space has been a domain of exploration for a long time, and certainly most of my adult life, it is now it's becoming a warfighting domain. And the Chinese are up there, the Russians are up there, and we need to pay a lot of attention to that. So having a commander, a member of the Joint Chiefs, who is focused on that full time with troops that's what they do for a living, I think it's really important for the country.
What do they do?
Well, they do a lot of classified stuff and a lot of unclassified stuff, but they pay a lot of attention to what's up there. Obviously, they're going to be looking at what Russia and China are doing. They're able to track things that are up there. Ideally, they will be able to defend us. They'll be able to defend vulnerable assets that are up there, satellites. I mean, we're tremendously dependent, on space for things in our country. I mean, globally, but certainly in our company. The best example, I think, is the global positioning system. We clearly are dependent on space for our communications, so they will defend, our assets, and we won't just do it alone. There are actually, and this sort of happens, there are other countries now that seem to be right on the brink of establishing their own space forces as well. That to me says, the message is we really need to do this and do it well.
You mentioned earlier that COVID was sort of an X-ray of all that has gone wrong or is going wrong, and how defenseless we are in so many ways. This is a question from Canada. Martin and Eileen in Canada want to know if the next war will be fought with viruses and microbes rather than missiles.
Well, that's been a concern for a long time. Certainly, the effects of this virus have been stunning to me, and shame on us if we don't prepare for exactly that in the future. It's very difficult to say, Warren. I'm actually hoping we never have another war, but past is prologue here. There haven't been too many periods of time where that didn't happen one way or another. The other thing, I like to say that we're batting 1,000 since we went into Grenada in 1983. We're batting 1,000 predicting where we'd go. I'm sorry, we're batting 0, 0, 0.
0, 0, thank you.
Yeah. We have a perfect record of not knowing what was next. So you have to be prepared for many things, if you will. And be prepared in a very strong way, and that's tough. And that takes resources to do that. So to preserve our way of life. Certainly, this was a wake-up call. I hope we learned the lessons from this in ways that really stick with us as we prepare for the future.
We've had several questions. I think that I can anticipate the answer, but I think it's important about how we protect those Afghans who were helpful to us for so many years and who are now at deadly risk from the Taliban.
Well, there's a lot of people that are equally concerned about that. And you've heard President Biden talk to that. That actually, my own view is he spoke to that because there was an awful lot of pressure brought to bear on his administration by lots of people. And I was involved with one of the outfits that was doing that because these people are very vulnerable. There was a quote I saw from an Afghan woman that said, you either have to take my husband and my family out of here, or we're walking out because we're going to be dead, and that's true. So I think we owe it to them. And in a situation like this, we can't wait for the system to sort of grind on under normal circumstances. You almost have to put a task force together, get them all moved, get them somewhere, and then vet them. And the numbers I've seen are upwards of 50 to 60,000 that we're talking about, all of which is doable. This is there's been a lot of press about the military saying they can do this. We do this. It's not routine, but we've done evacuations before. And so the military knows how to do it. That's not the issue. The flow point, the choke point is the State Department, the visa world. And we have to, first of all, get them out of the country. And then secondly, process them wherever we take them, where we have time and space and they're not threatened while we process them to see if they should come here.
We talked in general terms earlier about the Middle East, but Jeffrey wants to know, how do you see developments in the Middle East in light of the Abraham Accords?
How do I see developments in the Middle East? That's a tough place to predict. I don't have to tell you that. I worry I've worried always a great deal about, Israel and making sure many of you have been there. I was reminded in my many trips, every trip, I was reminded that this is a tough neighborhood and the timelines are short and there's no friends living around me. Even knowing that when I was back here in the States, it was refreshed in my head every time I went. And we are, I think, making sure that U.S. and Israel is aligned with respect to that is we must do that. That said, I'm not sure how much we can do for the rest of the Middle East. This is me. I'm way off Saudi Arabia right now. The Crown Prince is not a good guy. Was directly involved in killing this reporter. He's ruthless, and he's young, and so he's going to be around for a long time. And we are fortunately not as dependent on the Middle East as we used to be with respect to that. Now, that said, we can't turn away from Iran, period. I mean, you just can't walk away. We have to stay engaged to some degree there. But I think the main effort's got to be, as I said earlier, the main effort's got to be China.
We talked about China again, and Diana wants to know, what about Taiwan?
Well, you hear more and more about Xi Jinping's plans for Taiwan, and they seem to be more and more loaded with belligerent language. And I've been a supporter of the one China policy, for a long, long time. I do worry more and more about the current leader, Xi Jinping, and that he might try something. What I think oftentimes escapes Americans or the Western view is, or let's say in the United States, Taiwan to China is sort of like Nebraska to the U.S. They think they own it. It's theirs. That's how they feel about it. And it's just a matter of time. So, and we're committed, obviously, from an alliance standpoint, we're committed to defend the details of what that means and what we do, et cetera. You'd like to get to a point where you never had the problem. But clearly, Xi Jinping is heading in that direction. And I worry a great deal it's sooner rather than later. Sort of hear the message, and I don't know, I'm not briefed on the intel. The message is sort of at the end of this century. I'm not at the end, sorry, at the end of this decade, in the late 20s. In my view, you have to be ready for that now, not wait until 2027 or 2028 and try to get ready. And hopefully create a deterrent effect where Xi Jinping says, okay, today's not a good day, and all days in the future are not good days to physically take over Taiwan.
We started a bit late due to technical problems, but it's getting close to 6 o'clock and we do want to get off on time. We have a tradition here, which is to give you an opportunity for the last 2 or 3 minutes to say anything that you would like to in the way of closing remarks. Well,
first of all, I really appreciate the time, and I appreciate the effort and the discussion. It's a really important discussion, and I'm glad to see that it continues. And I look forward to actually tuning in now that I know what the link will be. Secondly, oftentimes when I speak publicly, someone will raise their hand and say, "You got anything good to say?" it's a really tough time right now. That said, and this for me goes to those that I went to war with in Iraq and Afghanistan, this young generation, as well as what I saw last summer, the young generation. I have great faith in them. They're an extraordinary group of people that I think will look to the future for our country and that will put us in good stead. How they get there, when they get there, where the leaders. I honestly, sort of across the board, I have a lot of faith in the leaders of my generation. I'm a Vietnam vet and came up in that time. And that was a tough time. Any of us that went through that know that. And I think we can get through where we are right now. But I am very encouraged by younger generations that they are actually going to carry on and get us into a really good place. So I try to invest my time in them. I try to do it in a way that makes a difference in terms of how they see the world and understand how they see the world right now.
Admiral Mike Mullen, it has been a real pleasure to talk with you, and I hope we have an opportunity to do it again. Thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Thank you. It's great to
I just want to remind our listeners, too, that the next time around, it's going to be on July 21st. It will be 2 New York Times Pulitzer Prize winners, Bret Stephens and David Leonhardt, talking about the impact of the year of COVID. I'm Warren Olney on behalf of Americans at the Crossroads. Thanks so much for joining us, and have a good night. Be safe. Wear the mask when you have to.